Morning was always painfully beautiful for Yuri. He stared out the broken window as the sun slowly rose over the horizon, creating a crimson backdrop against the decaying city. For a moment, Yuri was able to forget that this was the most dangerous area in the entire world. He forgot that inside each of these buildings were abominations of mutated flesh and bone, all seeking to devour his very soul. He forgot that littered among the landscape were otherworldly anomalies from hell, which laid silently in wait for their next helpless victim. He forgot that the only men he would meet in this place were others like himself, lost or evil men, wandering through an unknowable world under the illusion of getting rich or seeking adventure. In these few fleeting moments each morning, Yuri was able to breathe. As he laid on the floorboards of their temporary sanctuary, he was forced to remember as the dull chirp of a PDA notification went off. Yuri sat up and took off his makeshift blanket as he moved his poncho to the side. He looked around the room, which was now illuminated in the early morning light. Karp was sitting upright on a stool in the corner of the once apartment, his feet propped up on some moldy and decaying piece of furniture. An old nightstand had been turned into a table, and a small propane burner sat underneath of a steel cup. Karp sat as he pushed buttons on his PDA. All of this would have seemed almost quaint to an outsider, almost like seeing a man making his early morning coffee and reading the newspaper, if not for the fact that the dead body of his friend lay only feet from him. Karp looked up from his morning reading.
Ah, you're finally up. Bit of a late sleeper, aren't you? I can never really sleep in places like this. Too many mutants, you know?
Yuri rubbed his eyes and stood up. He stretched and cracked his back as he watched Karp put down his PDA and began to open a small tin of instant coffee.
I got over that a while ago.
Karp poured what Yuri would guess to be 5 tablespoons of the powder into his steel cup. He placed the tin onto the table and removed his knife, still covered with dried blood, and began to stir the coffee into the boiling water.
Well, good for you. You're going to need your strength if you're going with me.
Karp removed the knife from the water and tapped it on the rim of his cup before wiping it on his shirt sleeve. He placed it back in his sheath and, as he removed the cup from the burner, began to blow on it before taking a sip. Yuri stared in amazement at his new companion. Karp waved at Yuri, beckoning him to come sit. Yuri walked past the corpse on the floor, which was now covered by a trench coat. He stepped over the dry blood, and he moved a stool closer to Karp and sat. Yuri looked up at his new friend as he continued to sip his coffee. Karp reached out towards Yuri, cup in hand.
Here, drink this. Wake up a little bit.
Yuri looked at the steaming cup and then back at Karp. He reached his hand out and took the coffee. It had been a while since he had tasted any. He sipped it and passed it back to his friend. He wasn't sure if it was the old metal mug or Kieran's blood, but the coffee had a distinct metallic taste that did more to wake him up than caffeine ever could.
So, any update on your contact?
Yeah, he's about a kilometer southeast of us.
Yuri grabbed the pack of cigarettes in his jacket pocket.
Any ETA?
As if that lazy fuck would come up to us. We've got to move to him. We're supposed to meet him in a couple of hours.
Yuri lit the cigarette between his lips and began to puff, the taste of tobacco mixed with the copper coffee taste in his mouth. He looked over at the corpse of Kieran, laying not feet from him.
Anything you want to do with your friend before we go?
Not much we can do. He's dead, and I'm not dragging him with us. I think most of his gear was in his backpack, but you're welcome to check his pockets.
Yuri stood up from his stool and walked over to Kieran's body. He squatted down and slowly removed the makeshift death shroud that was draped over his body. His eyes were still open, and a look of fear was frozen into his face. Yuri looked deep into the dead eyes and wondered when he would become like Kieran. He patted down the body. He rolled Kieran's body to the side so that he could reach into his back pockets. Yuri felt something that felt like a piece of paper and removed it. It was a simple photograph, a woman with a child. On the back of the picture, only a date, May 3rd, 2014, and the word home. Yuri stared at the photograph as ash from his cigarette fell onto the woman's face. He quickly brushed the gray flakes off and put the photograph into his back pocket.
You find anything over there?
Nothing that matters. You want to gear up and get going?
Karp tipped the cup and leaned his head back, draining the rest of its contents before dumping out the few remaining drops. The two began to gather their equipment. Yuri slid his backpack over his shoulders before draping his poncho over himself. He picked up his AK-74 that was leaning up against the wall and slung it over his neck, allowing it to hang over his chest. He didn't have much else to his name other than a few simple supplies in his pack and the few dozen rounds of ammunition. Karp, on the other hand, was equipped fairly well. After putting his trench coat back on and wiping away some of the blood which had now stained it, he began to sort through Kieran's pack and take all the food, medicine, and ammo. Karp put on his backpack as well and grabbed his SKS off of the floor. Then he turned to Yuri.
All right, let's go. Bearing 137. That way.
Karp threw Yuri an old compass, one that had certainly seen better days. Yuri opened it and tested it by holding it out away from his body and slowly turning. It seemed to be consistently showing north, which was somewhat uncommon, as most of the compasses in this area simply didn't function properly.
Thanks. I'll take point.
Yuri slowly put his ear to the door of the apartment, listening for anything that might still be creeping around in the hallway. He heard nothing but the breeze penetrating inside the room through the broken window that looked out at the abandoned city. He turned the doorknob slowly, pulling it back just enough to create a small crack to peek through. The hallway was dark, but it seemed empty. He checked left and then to the right, waiting for some hidden threat to suddenly jump out and attack. But nothing came. He turned back to Karp and motioned for him to come forward. Yuri pressed the button on the flashlight that he had taped to the handguard of his AK. He covered the left side of the hallway, exposing only a small portion of his head and the barrel of his gun. Karp moved quickly down the hallway to the right, jogging through the darkness towards the door that they had entered through last night. Yuri waited for a moment, and then followed, as he saw the light from outside pour in and saturate the hallway. The light stung Yuri's eyes as he left the decaying building. Rows of old Soviet-era structures served as a backdrop for the long-abandoned cars that lined the street. Karp walked ahead into the open street, his head turning slowly from side to side. Yuri stood just outside the door and gazed to his left, searching for any sign of movement in the early morning. Crows cawed as they flew over his head. The wind blew softly. During the day, this cursed city seemed to be lifeless, as if it was forgotten by time, and it was difficult to imagine that last night the streets were full of zombies, not feet away from where they stood now. Yuri moved further down the steps and into the street, coming up behind Karp, who was down on one knee beside a rusted Lada with his PDA in one hand and a compass in the other. Yuri scanned his surroundings frantically as Karp began to mutter and curse under his breath as he pressed buttons on his PDA. After a few moments of fighting with the old, dilapidated piece of technology, Karp was able to pull up a map of the area.
The meetup spot is that way.
Yuri nodded as Karp put the PDA and compass back into his pockets. The two arose and began to walk through the abandoned streets of Lemansk, heading towards their objective. Occasionally a bird or a rat would move as they startled it, but other than that, the city seemed quite dead. There was nothing to say as the two walked, and even if there was, they wouldn't risk it. Row after row of old, dilapidated cars, slowly rusting in the open air, and crumbling concrete buildings dominated their landscape. Slowly, as they continued traveling south, the buildings became smaller, and the cars became fewer. More trees began to fill the skyline. After an hour and a half of slow travel through the cursed city, the two finally made it out. The air began to smell more fresh, and the landscape appeared more green. Yuri looked down at his feet, which were now almost concealed by the knee-high grass that he walked through. It had been ages since he walked on natural turf. He had almost forgotten the feel of grass brushing against his pants and the sound of light crunching as he took step after step. The hard streets of Lemansk were burned into his soul. Yuri's eyes rose from the ground as he noticed Karp turn around, walking backwards as he pressed buttons on his PDA.
We're almost there. Another 200 meters or so.
Yuri nodded and followed along. Through a small tree line, Yuri could make out the remains of an old farm building, something that was perhaps once a barn. There was no roof on the structure, simply 4 stone walls that had begun to crumble apart as time and neglect slowly took their toll. As the two approached the tree line, Karp took a knee and stared down at the old barn. Yuri followed along and crouched down into the long grass, concealing himself as best as he could.
The guy was supposed to meet us here at 10.
Yuri looked down at his watch, confirming that it was in fact 10 after 10.
Well, you know how it goes in the zone. He's probably just running a few minutes behind.
Yeah, well, either that or he's dead, which means our payday is dead too.
Yuri's curiosity finally got the better of him. He finally brought himself to ask the question that had been on his mind since they left their shelter.
What's the job, anyway? You haven't said much about it other than these consects is supposed to meet us here.
Karp moved off of one knee and sat flat on the ground. He began to tug and prod at the straps on his backpack.
Well, take a load off. I'll tell you about it while we wait to find out what happened to Ivanov.
Yuri sat down beside his new comrade and took off his pack as well. He laid his rifle beside him in the grass. The two began to rummage through their backpacks, retrieving food and water, which was much needed after their long journey.
So basically, a few weeks ago while I was over at this science station in Yantar, one of these egghead types was looking for someone to take on a high-risk, high-reward job.
Karp said as he made finger quotations in the air. Karp picked up a piece of sausage and took a large bite out of it.
So I told this guy, I'm down for pretty much anything. He tells me there's some kind of new compound he's been developing and hands me this weird-looking gun with an air tank attached to it. He tells me, go shoot the flesh and bring it back to camp. How could that be? So I do it.
Karp took another bite while grabbing for his PDA out of his jacket.
So I dragged this thing's fat ass back to the station. I thought it was some kind of poison that killed mutants and he wanted to do an autopsy on the body. But no, this crazy bastard didn't make poison. He made a tranquilizer. He hands me a stack of cash and asks me to do it again. I swear, he's trying to collect them.
Yuri stared at Karp in disbelief as he took a sip from his canteen.
Our mission is to capture a mutant. Not kill it. Not bring back some organ or sample. Is to actually capture one.
Oh yeah, dude is nuts. But he was loaded. I'm always up for making money from the zone.
Okay, that's reasonable, but what is the target? You didn't bring me out here to try to, capture a pseudo-giant or something, did you? Because that's pretty insane, man.
No. What do you take me for? I like the odd challenge here and there. And the adrenaline, but that's just stupid. Ivanov actually just wants a chimera, which is lucky, because there's been reports of one in the Red Forest, which is not too far from here.
Yuri stared at the stalker, who now sat across from him. Was he insane, or did he just want to die? There was no way to tell with the guys he would meet up this far north in the zone. Either way, the idea didn't sit well with him. He thought to himself all the ways that this could go horribly wrong. There was no way this could be done, even if the scientist had developed some world-class tranquilizer serum. And even if the serum worked, there was no way to drag a chimera across the zone without losing the body or simply dying. Yuri stood up and collected his gear, placing it back in his backpack before grabbing his rifle.
Okay, thanks for the offer, Karp. I'll take my chances back in Limansk.
Come on, man. I need someone good on my 6 with me on this one. I'll split the cash with you, 50-50. It's enough to live a life like a king out here.
Yuri patted himself off and slung his backpack over his shoulders, and he began to walk back towards the rotting skyline of Lemansk.
What good is money if you can't spend it?
As he began to walk away from his new friend, the sound of a PDA notification stopped him in his tracks as he turned around. He looked back up at Karp, who now had a wide grin on his face as he looked down at his PDA.
Hey, guess who just showed up? Come on, dude, let's at least hear him out.
What's the worst that can happen?